Chapter 4. A History That Continues. The Century of the Church's Social Doctrine. History is not just something that happened. History is something that is still happening. And the question this chapter asks us is uncomfortable. Are we continuing the history of love? Or continuing the history of indifference? Because the Church's social teaching did not begin in books. It began in suffering. It began in factories where workers were treated like machines. It began in streets where the poor were invisible. It began in homes where hunger was normal. And something remarkable happened. The poor did not remain silent. Workers began to speak. Women began to demand dignity. Young people began to challenge injustice. Communities began to fight discrimination. And the Church listened. Not from palaces, but from the margins. Because one of the deepest truths of this chapter is this: reality looks different when seen from the edge. The poor see what the comfortable cannot see. They understand dependence on God in a way success often forgets. They understand community because survival requires it. They understand hope because without it they could not continue. And this is why the Church insists. The poor are not just people we help. They are people we must learn from. A treasury of voices that refuse to be silent. For more than 150 years, popes have raised their voices for those without one. When Pope Leo XIII wrote Rerum Novarum, he was not writing theory. He was responding to suffering. He saw workers living in conditions unworthy of human dignity and said clearly, society cannot call itself just if the worker lives in misery. Later, St. John 23 expanded this vision. He reminded the world that poverty is not just a local problem. It is a global moral question. Rich nations cannot pretend hunger elsewhere is not their concern. Because Christianity does not allow comfortable distance. It demands moral closeness. Then came the Second Vatican Council. And something powerful happened there. The Church began to rediscover something essential. If Christ is at the center, the poor must also be at the center. Because Christ is mysteriously present in them. Not symbolically. Not poetically. But spiritually and morally real. One bishop said something shocking. The mystery of Christ is the mystery of Christ in the poor. This changes everything. Because it means ignoring the poor is not just a social failure. It becomes a spiritual blindness. A church that looks like Christ. The council helped the Church ask a difficult question. What should the Church look like? Powerful? Influential? Comfortable? Or like Christ? And Christ chose poverty. Not because poverty is good, but because love goes where suffering exists. The Church began to see more clearly. If Christ walked among the poor, the Church must walk there too. If Christ touched suffering, the Church must not remain distant. If Christ gave himself, the Church cannot live for itself. Because the credibility of Christianity has never depended on its buildings. It depends on whether it resembles Jesus. Structures of sin that create poverty and extreme inequality. This chapter introduces a phrase that may sound uncomfortable. Structures of sin. What does that mean? It means poverty is not always accidental. Sometimes it is organized. Sometimes it is protected. Sometimes it is justified. Sometimes systems are built in ways that allow a few to rise while many remain trapped. And this chapter challenges a dangerous illusion. That markets alone will fix everything. That growth automatically reaches everyone. That the suffering must simply wait. But the gospel never says, wait until the system improves. The gospel says, respond now. Because dignity delayed is dignity denied. The chapter reminds us strongly. Human dignity cannot be postponed. Justice cannot be scheduled for tomorrow. Compassion cannot be outsourced. The danger of becoming used to inequality. One of the greatest dangers is not injustice itself, It is getting used to it. When inequality becomes normal, something inside society breaks. When we see suffering daily and feel nothing, something inside us breaks. Pope Francis warns about this normalization. A world where excess and extreme poverty exist side by side is not just economically unbalanced. It is morally wounded. And the real danger is this. Not that people argue against the poor, but that they forget them. Because indifference is quieter than injustice, but often more dangerous. The poor as subjects. Perhaps the most revolutionary idea in this chapter is this. The poor are not objects of charity. They are subjects of history. They are not just receivers. They are contributors. They are not just people we lift up. They are people who lift the church. This is a radical shift. Because it means the poor evangelize us too. Their faith, their endurance, their solidarity, their trust in God. These become lessons for those who have everything except peace. The chapter says something very profound. We must allow ourselves to be evangelized by the poor. Because they often know how to survive without security, how to trust without guarantees, how to share without abundance, how to hope without evidence. And maybe this is why Jesus said, the kingdom belongs to the poor. Not because they suffer, but because they often understand dependence on God more deeply. The wisdom hidden in suffering. The chapter ends with a quiet but powerful truth. Those who never experienced insecurity have something to learn from those who live with it daily. The poor often carry a hidden wisdom. How to endure. How to forgive. How to remain human in hardship. How to believe when life is unstable. And maybe this is why this chapter ends not with statistics, but with a challenge. Will we simplify our lives? Or complicate our excuses? Because the future of society depends on how we answer questions like, do the weak have equal dignity? Do the less successful have equal worth? Do those with fewer opportunities matter less? And the gospel answers clearly. No human being is disposable. Final reflection. This chapter is not really about economics. It is about vision. Do we see the poor as problems? Or as persons? Do we see charity as occasional help? Or as a way of life? Do we believe history is finished? Or do we believe we are writing the next chapter? Because the history of the church's social teaching is not finished. It continues. In our choices. In our priorities. In our generosity. In our courage to care. And maybe the real question of this chapter is this. When future generations look back, will they say we continued the history of love? Or the history of indifference?